Hello and welcome back to Something Z, and welcome to If Deku Had Venom Part 5. Last time on the What If, the final exams happened, with Izuku and Bakugo being able to win by coming together and cooperating. Then after the finals, Class 1A and 1B went to a summer training camp to hone their skills. But a couple days into the camp trip, a villain attack took place, with a group of villains attacking. Then after a fight with Muscular and getting to Bakugo, and after a long search, Izuku and Bakugo got captured by the League of Villains. Okay, so now that's out of the way, let's jump into the video in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so we begin this what if days after the attack, and currently Izuku and Bakugo were trapped, with both of them being restrained to chairs, with them being handcuffed with anti-quirk cuffs. But because the League knew that Izuku's quirk or Venom was different, they did experiments on Izuku. And currently he was surrounded by speakers that were shooting out high loud frequencies, and it was so high that no one else could hear it or feel its effects, except for Izuku and Venom, with them both writhing in pain, with them not even being able to hear themselves or each other. And just now, Shigaraki and the rest of the remaining League walked into the bar. And when Shigaraki walked in, he had a glass container in his hand. Then he walked in front of Bakugo and gave him a proposition, which was to resign from being a hero and join the League, and he will give him freedom. Then hearing this, Bakugo asked what about Izuku, and hearing this, Shigaraki began to laugh. Then he immediately walked over to Izuku, so he was only a couple feet away. Then he lifted up the container he had, and when he did, he showed the two the liquid that was inside. And the liquid inside was a dark bluish liquid, which seemed normal, but after a couple seconds it began to move around, like it was alive. And immediately seeing this, Izuku was able to figure out what it was. It was another symbiote. And seeing the realization on Izuku's face, Shigaraki began to laugh even more. Then Shigaraki placed the bottle on a nearby table and he undid the cuffs on Bakugo. But the second that Bakugo was released, he fired explosions and he fired himself at the speakers, which when he got to them he fired more explosions, destroying them after a couple seconds. Then Bakugo began to fight the villains, with Shigaraki quickly putting the bottle back into his coat pocket. Then after a couple seconds, Izuku and Venom were able to recover from the sound waves, with Izuku being able to gain back control. So he then covered himself in the symbiote. Then once Izuku was in the suit, Izuku burst through the chains and cuffs, and he began to help fight the villains. But before either side could win, there was a knock on the door, and after a couple of seconds, the wall next to the door got destroyed, making a giant hole. And standing in the hole was a group of heroes, with some being Kamui Woods, All Might, Edgeshot, and a small old man Izuku didn't recognize. And seeing them, Shigaraki put his hand towards his coat pocket, but before he was able to get to the symbiote offspring, the old man shot himself towards Shigaraki, making Shigaraki get flung a couple feet. Meanwhile, Kamui Woods used his quirk to restrain the remaining League of Villains members, and seeing that he was trapped by wood, Dabi tried to use his quirk to burn Kamui. But before he was able to do any real damage, Gran Torino shot himself towards Dabi and he kicked him in the head, knocking him out. Then while the villains were restrained, Izuku began to walk towards Shigaraki to try to get the symbiote, and to figure out how it was created. But before he was able to get to Shigaraki, portals began to appear around the pub that weren't controlled by Kurogiri, and they both summoned Nomus into the hideout, and they also grabbed Izuku, Bakugo, and the villains. And when Izuku was able to see again, he found himself in a completely different area. And when he looked around, he found himself in a destroyed city block, with the surrounding buildings being in complete ruin. And when he looked around, he saw that the villains were still on the ground. But then Izuku's eyes went 20 feet in front of him. And what he saw was a villain that he hasn't seen before. And it was a guy in a black suit with a glass mask over his face. And Izuku and Venom were easily able to figure out that it was the leader of the League, because he seems to be emitting a dangerous aura. Then before All For One could do anything, All Might came flying down from the sky and he tried to tackle the villain. But when the two collided, they seemed to be at equal strengths, with the two not moving for a bit. And while the two powers were fighting each other, the remaining League members got up, and they began to fight Izuku and Bakugo. And the two groups began to fight, with the two students being able to hold their own for a bit. But after Shigaraki got punched by Izuku getting flung a couple feet, Shigaraki got back up and he grabbed the container that was still in his coat pocket, and he undid the top, which made the symbiote start to crawl out, with it latching onto Shigaraki's hand. And seeing this, Izuku shot out a tendril to try to stop him, but by the time the tendril got to him, it was too late, with a blackish blue hand catching the tendril and tearing it off. And when the tendril hit the ground, Shigaraki let the symbiote crawl on him even more, covering him even more. Then once the symbiote had completely covered Shigaraki, his face had gained a giant smile and the teeth were similar to a shark's, and his body mass seemed to be bigger than it was before. Then he let out a blood-curdling screech. Then after he let out all of his air, he shouted,
"We are Riot!"
Then after he let out the screech, he charged at Izuku, and the two symbiote users began to fight, with Shigaraki having the upper hand because Riot is more physically stronger than Venom. But even with that, Shigaraki was still stronger because while Shigaraki was still wearing the symbiote, his quirk was still functional. making him even more of a threat than he was before. So the fight with Shigaraki running and trying to attack Izuku using his super strength or trying to hit him with his quirk, while Izuku tried to hit him from a distance, leaving Bakugo to fight the remaining League of Villains members on his own. But before either of those students could fall, they hear Yaoyorozu shout for them to close their eyes now. And hearing this, the two students obliged in a couple seconds. Then while the two students' eyes were closed, multiple flash and smoke bombs were thrown in the area that they were in, which blinded the villains. And hearing the explosions go off, Izuku quickly shot a web from where he last saw Bakugo, and he dragged him onto a building, which he was able to jump to. And thanks to the distraction, the two were not seen. And while the two students were on the roof, Izuku saw his classmates in a nearby alleyway. So he picked up Bakugo and the two landed in the alleyway. And after they were able to reunite with their classmates, the group of students ran away, eventually getting to a large crowded area where they were able to watch the remaining fight. Meanwhile, the second Izuku and Bakugo were able to escape, All for One using Kurogiri's quirk made a portal, and using Magna's quirk made the League of Villains get pulled in. And even though Shigaraki pleaded for him to stay and fight, he was unable to escape the magnetic pull, so he got dragged into the portal as well. So he got pulled in as well, allowing him and the symbiote to escape and get stronger. Then once everyone was gone besides All For One and All Might, the two began to fight without holding back, with the results being the same with All Might being able to win, but in exchange he lost the remaining pieces of One For All that was left in his system. And a couple days later, Aizawa and All Might told all the parents of Class 1A that the students will be moving into the dorms. And because Izuku was just captured by the League of Villains, Inko sees it as a good idea to move into the dorms, because if he's surrounded by many pro-heroes, then it's unlikely he will be able to get captured again. But after the meeting with Inko, All Might led Izuku outside of his apartment, and he began to talk, with All Might telling Izuku that he knows that he doesn't actually have a quirk, and rather that he has some sort of creature with him, and he knows this because of what happened with Shigaraki and Riot. But then after he said this, All Might told Izuku that the government wasn't going to say anything about him or Venom, because that could raise concern and could cause problems. Then after he told him that, he told him to be careful, because from now on he will have more eyes on him. Then once All Might said all of this, he left. Then after the meeting with Izuku a couple days later, the students move into the dorms, with the thing with Sue still happening. Okay, so now we skip a week before the school year begins. And by this point, Class 1A has settled into the dorms. And that morning, Aizawa told Class 1A to meet him in Gym Gamma, wearing their hero costumes. And when they get there, Aizawa, Ectoplasm, and Cementos were waiting for them. And they were told that they will be coming up with ultimate moves for the upcoming provisional license exams that were in about a week. And when Aizawa was done talking, he spread out all of Class 1A through the gymnasium with an Ectoplasm clone. And once Izuku got his Ectoplasm clone and a place to train, he began to think about an ultimate move. And after a week, he was able to somewhat perfect it, which was a technique that he called Venomous Duplicate. And basically what Izuku and Venom practice of Venom taking a human form, while he's off of Izuku, allowing the two to fight independently or multitask. But the downside is that Venom can only exist in that form for around half an hour before Venom starts to feel drained, and it goes back to being a liquid. And while Venom is in that state, he can transform himself to look like just about any other person. Or he can look like Izuku while he's in the outfit. Also, because Izuku's suit is just Venom, he doesn't get a costume change. Okay, so now we skip to the day of the license exams. When Class 1A gets to the place where the exams are taking place, and they meet the same people as they do in the canon, so they know about Inasa and Miss Joke. And after a bit of talking, Class 1A went into the examination site. And when they got dressed into their hero costumes, they went to the examination room. And when the main examiner believed that all the examinees were present, he began to explain the first part of the exams, which only the first 100 examinees to finish will pass. And when he's done explaining, he passes out 3 targets and balls to each student. And when they all placed them, the walls of the room began to unfold. And Izuku had them sticking out Venom, so they were basically just stuck to him. And once the walls were done unfolding, the examinees found themselves in a large arena. Then they were given a couple minutes to split up, with most of Class 1A sticking together, besides Bakugo, Kirishima, and Kaminari, and going by himself, Todoroki leaves as well. And after a couple minutes, the exams began, and when it did, the crushing of UA began. So all the enemy schools began to attack Class 1A, but thanks to each other's quirks and help, Class 1A was able to make it so they weren't able to get hit, and Izuku stayed alive by dodging the balls with his quick reaction time and speed. And whenever a ball flew past him, Izuku shot out a web and he flung it back at whoever threw it at him, with him being able to get a couple targets, but he wasn't able to get an actual full person. But after a couple minutes of this, Yo was able to tell that they wouldn't be able to get rid of Class 1A if they were all together. So he put his hands together and he began to vibrate the ground with his quirk. And after a couple seconds, he began to make tremors, with the ground starting to split apart and crumble, launching the class. And in the process, it split up all of Class 1A. And while Izuku was falling, he dropped the balls he had on him. And a couple minutes after Izuku landed, Izuku was able to see again. And when he was able to see, he began to look around. And when he did, he saw that none of his classmates were around him. And after seeing this, Izuku began to walk around to try to find his classmates. But after a couple minutes, he began to feel a tingling sensation in his head. So he turned around, and when he did, he saw that Kami was behind him with a ball in her hand. And seeing this, Izuku shot out a web which hit the ball, making the ball go flying, and getting stuck to a nearby rock. And once the ball hit the rock, the two students began to fight, with Izuku trying his best to make her tired enough so that he could easily grab the ball and hit her targets. And in the process, Izuku destroyed the ground around him. So a couple minutes later, before the two were able to settle their conflict, they got surrounded by an enemy school. And seeing this, Izuku looked at Kami, but when he did, she was gone. And seeing that it was Izuku all alone, the school began to bombard Izuku with balls to try to hit his targets, which he was able to dodge with somewhat ease. But after a minute of this, Izuku began to slow down from exhaustion. But before he was able to get too tired, Ochako showed up on a rock that was above him, and she extended out her hand. But when she did, she slipped on the rock she was standing on. And while she was falling, Izuku ran to her and he grabbed her in the air. And when he caught her, he began to run away. And eventually, the two were able to lose the enemy school. And once they lost them, the two hid behind a rock. And while they were hidden, Izuku was scouting the area to make sure that they were still hidden. But while Izuku was on lookout, he remembered that for the past week, Ochako has been focusing on making herself float, so she wouldn't have to worry about falling. Then once Izuku realized this, Izuku began to feel a tingling sensation in his head. Then he immediately turned around and he grabbed Ochako's hand. And in her hand was a ball that was right next to one of his targets. Then he told her that she must have been a fake, since the real Ochako could have easily gotten out of that situation. And realizing that she had been found out, Ochako's face began to melt. And once it was done melting, it was revealed to be Kami. But before anything could happen, the real Ochako and Sero appeared. And when Kami sees them, she retreated. And after confirming that the two were the real things, the three began to come up with a plan to get the targets that they need. And the plan was Izuku running around, getting a crowd of people's attention. Then once he was able to get a decent amount of people, he stopped, making the crowd of people surround him. Then once they were preparing to throw their balls, Izuku seemed to have melted, and he turned into a liquid, slipping into the cracks in the ground. Because in reality, Izuku and Venom had split up from each other, and Venom took the appearance of Izuku's targets on. And seeing this, the crowd of people were stunned, because they were confused about what had just happened. And before they were able to react, Ochako threw weightless rocks at the group of people, with Sero's tape attached to them. And when they were over the group, she gave them weight again, making the rocks fall to the ground. And when the rocks hit the ground, the group of people were stuck to the ground. And once the people were stuck, Ochako, Sero, and Izuku came out of their hiding spots. And while Izuku was walking to the group, Venom jumped back onto him, and he went back into the suit. Then once the three got to the group, they grabbed a ball that was laying on the ground. Then once they picked it up, they got the targets that they needed. And once they got the targets that they needed, they were told on the speakers to get to the waiting room. And when the three got to the waiting room, Bakugo, Kirishima, and Kaminari got there at the same time. And after a couple minutes, the first phase of the exams ended. But because Ida wasn't alive anymore, Ayama didn't shoot the laser into the sky, summoning the remaining classmates of Class 1A. So around half the class wasn't able to pass into the next of the license exam. Okay, so when the break was over, the main examiner got onto a podium, and he began to congratulate them all for making it so far. Then he shows them on big screens in the front of the room, the arena they were just in blow up. And when the explosions were over, the examiner told them that a villain had just attacked the city, then fled. But there were many civilians that got caught in the crossfire, and he told them that it was their job to rescue the injured civilians. And once he said that, the room began to unfold again. And when the room was completely flat, the exams began again. And when it did, the remaining members of Class 1A were in one group, besides Bakugo, Kirishima, and Kaminari. And after a couple seconds of running, the group comes across a small child who has blood coming from their head. And Izuku got some points taken away because when he was inspecting the kid for injuries, he blurted out that this doesn't look good. And after Izuku got yelled at by the kid for being so blunt, Izuku uncovered his face, and he told the kid that everything will be okay, with a smile on his face. And when the kid saw this, he allowed Izuku to rescue him. So Izuku then covered up his face again and he grabbed the kid, and he began to run to the first aid station while the rest of Class 1A split up to save more people. And after Izuku was able to secure the kid, he was about to run back to the city to find more victims. But before he was able to move, he and everyone else in the arena heard the main examiner on the speakers, telling them that the villain that attacked the city has come back for round 2. And right after he was done speaking, someone burst through the walls of the arena, making a massive hole. And when the dust settled, Izuku and everyone else at the first aid station sees Gang Orca and dozens of his henchmen. And seeing this, Izuku ran towards a group of people. But before he was able to get to them, he gets stopped by Yo, who continues to run towards the group. Then when he was somewhat close to the group, he put his hands to the ground, and he uses Quirk to create tremors under the group. But as a counterattack, Gang Orca uses Quirk on Yo, and he hit him point blank with an ultrasonic wave attack, paralyzing him. And when Yo hit the ground, Izuku ran at the group of villains again. And when he got to them, he began to do crowd control, with him mainly going after the henchmen, before he went after Gang Orca, with him being able to take out around half of his henchmen after around a minute. Then after he did that, Izuku began to fight Orca, with him being able to avoid many of Orca's attacks, but not all of them. with him being able to handle himself against Orca somewhat. But things began to take a turn because the same things happened between Inasa and Todoroki while Izuku was fighting Gang Orca, with fire flying everywhere. And after a couple streams of flames, a wave of flames began to fly towards a paralyzed Yo. And seeing this, Izuku ran towards Yo as fast as he could. And before he got to them, Izuku shot out a web, which hit Yo in the chest. Then Izuku pulled Yo towards himself, making Yo fly into his arms. And once Yo was secured in Izuku's arms, Izuku began to run away to find a place to put Yo. But while he was running, he and Venom shouted simultaneously, "What the hell is wrong with you two?" And hearing this, the two decided to work together. So after 30 seconds, the two were able to surround Gang Orca in a spiral of flames. But even though it was weakening him, it wasn't enough to defeat Gang Orca, because he had a water bottle on him and he used it to make it so he wouldn't get dehydrated. And seeing this, Izuku and Venom both prepared themselves, and they jumped through the flames, making the two scream in pain for a couple seconds. Then once they got over the pain, they began to fight Gang Orca again. But because they were surrounded by a flame vortex, they were weakened. Then after a minute of fighting, Venom gave out, making Izuku revert back to normal. And when he got turned back to normal, Orca held him up by his arm. But before he could do anything, the main examiner announced through the speakers that the final civilian has been saved. So now the exams are over. And that's where I'm going to leave the what if. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time on Something Z.